highway, when it was planned through downtown Indianapolis, had a really devastating impact on urban neighborhoods. Over 17,000 people were displaced.
The placement of the interstates is not random and it's not accidental. The interstates were put where they are with a specific purpose in mind.
The Morris Butler House was a very fine example of a Civil War era property. Mr. Lilly paid for the purchase of the property and for the gradual restoration. He did not want the house leveled by the highway. The Morris Butler House survives to this day, and there's a slight dip in the highway. The people who were displaced, by and large, were low income, many of them minority.
I was standing in the yard eating a popsicle, and I watched them tear down the Warner's house on this side. We stood on the other side, and we watched them tear the houses down on this side. And eventually, ours was one of the last ones to be torn down. Most people don't know these things. I mean, they're shocked when I tell them some of the stories about how these things happen.
The story begins with the invention of the automobile.
The automobile came to market in the late 19th century.
The automobile needed roads, but the roads at that time were generally awful.
What a horse and buggy or wagon could do, cars often could not. It would just about make your teeth rattle going down the road at anything more than the pace of a horse.
I say that's wrong.
Car enthusiasts wanted better roads so their cars didn't break down. But roads are expensive to build and maintain.
That's all fine and dandy for you people in town, but what about us farmers?
The farmers had been pushing for years about the roads because the farmer often was taking his crop halfway across the county or sometimes halfway across the state. So it was a day or 2 day journey to get where he needed to get with his crop and get back home.
Later, developers would make a case for better roads. Visionaries like William Levitt realized that the automobile could allow Americans to live further from their work, where they can breathe fresh air and escape the grind of the city. Another argument for better roads was national defense.
The Army decided to do a cross-country expedition from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. It was mainly dirt roads. The trucks broke down because the roads were in such bad shape. Sometimes they got a vehicle stuck, and it may take half a day to get one vehicle out of a ditch. There were places where they had to cross shallow rivers and creeks where there were no bridges, so they had to actually create their own or find a way to ford the river with their trucks and with their wagons. Eisenhower, at this time, was a younger officer. It took them 62 days to get from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. It taught the Army and it taught Eisenhower a valuable lesson.
During World War II, as Allied commander of the European theater, General Eisenhower witnessed firsthand the advantages of the German Autobahn system.
Eisenhower and the other generals along with him, the other officers in the U.S. Army, they realized quickly that the United States could not move equipment and personnel as quickly and as easily as the Germans could. The United States did not have a road network like that.
When Eisenhower became president, he had the political clout to do something about it.
Today in Washington, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. The act will create a national system of interstate and defense highways.
The National Highway System would become the largest man-made project in modern history. Although the general routes of the interstate were determined federally, decisions about the exact placement of the routes were left up to the states. the Indiana State Highway Commission engaged the Chicago engineering firm of H.W. Lochner to assess the potential routes for the federal interstate highway system through Indianapolis. Lochner provided several viable options for interstate construction through downtown Indianapolis, but consistently recommended construction through minority neighborhoods.
What happened in Indianapolis is not unlike what happened across America.
Minority neighborhoods were disproportionately sacrificed for the greater good in cities all over the United States. The official reason? Their land was cheaper to acquire. But just because an act is not intentionally racist doesn't make it okay. Although bulldozing through minority neighborhoods appears to have a purely economic motivation, one can't help but wonder, why were African American neighborhoods cheaper to buy, and did racism have anything to do with it? After the Civil War, the U.S. government enacted laws aimed at integrating former slaves into American society. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 allowed them to move freely and to purchase their own property anywhere in the country. However, laws made in Washington, D.C. often failed to make an impact. After the turn of the century, many African Americans left the rural South for better opportunities in the North. At the time, Indianapolis was a relatively new city, and it welcomed new settlers. At first, African Americans lived in mixed neighborhoods, but by the late 19th century, like in the more prominent northern cities of Chicago and New York, purely black neighborhoods began to take shape in Indianapolis.
So what makes Indianapolis unique about the Indianapolis black community is that it was a particular size.
Richard Pierce is a historian at Notre Dame University who has written an influential book about the history of the black community in Indianapolis.
By 1910, there were already 9% of the population was African American. By 1930, it was 11 to 12% of the population was African American. In comparison to cities like Chicago and New York and Detroit, they had 3 to 4 times the percentage of African Americans.
Most northern cities had one black neighborhood. Indianapolis had 3. The oldest neighborhood, which was located along the canal, was referred to as the Bottoms. Just north of the Bottoms was the 6th Ward. The 3rd black neighborhood was on the east side near Douglas Park. By the 1920s, the black population in Indianapolis grew significantly, and the 3 neighborhoods could no longer support the number of black residents. Black families naturally started looking for housing opportunities outside those neighborhoods. But 5 decades after being freed, African Americans found there was a big difference between the way things are on paper and the way things are in reality. On paper, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 secured the right for African Americans to buy and own property anywhere they chose. But in reality, heavy resistance from the white community made it virtually impossible for African Americans to move beyond the prescribed neighborhoods.
Minority communities were segregated through a number of vehicles.
In the 1920s, the white community in Indianapolis deployed terrorist violence to keep black people out of white neighborhoods.
1920s in Indiana was the Ku Klux Klan era.
At its peak, the Indiana Klan had 250,000 members, and it wielded enormous political power. By 1925, the Indiana General Assembly was controlled by politicians openly sympathetic to the Klan. The governor and many high-ranking city officials were Klan members. During this time, racists used violence and intimidation towards the black community to maintain their dominance.
Someone shooting through a window or throwing a rock through a window, the harassment of children going to school, occasionally a cross burned in the front yard, loud noises and disturbances in the middle of the night to frighten people.
Spike fences were high fences around neighborhoods where people put signs and posters and tried to isolate African Americans from the neighbors.
And they just ran the gamut to try to intimidate African Americans from moving into white neighborhoods.
It wasn't associations that did it, it was just individuals.
But the local government didn't shy away from openly endorsing segregation either. For example, in 1926, the city of Indianapolis passed Ordinance Number 15.
African Americans and whites were restricted from moving to a neighborhood in which the opposite race was a majority unless a majority of the people in the neighborhood signed off on their moving in. They thought that it would pass the Supreme Court test for two reasons. One, it applied to black and whites equally, and it didn't restrict home purchases, it restricted home moving ins. So you can buy a house, but you can't move into it.
The mayor's legal counsel informed him before the ordinance was ever enacted that it wouldn't pass constitutional scrutiny. Indianapolis Mayor John L. Duval ignored legal advice and signed it into law, firm in the belief that it meets with the approval of the great mass of people in the interest of peace and happiness. Mayor Duval knew that a previous Supreme Court decision rendered the ordinance illegal, but because of the heavy influence of the Ku Klux Klan, he supported it publicly and let the courts do the dirty work of striking it down. Another way in which black people were denied housing outside of certain neighborhoods was through the use of racially restrictive covenants. Covenants impose specified duties and restrictions upon a property. These specifications were typically written into the property deed,
which basically said that when you purchased a property, you could not sell that property to an African American, or you could not rent that property to an African American.
It was common for covenants to run with the land, whereby the terms of the covenant were conveyed to future buyers and sellers, thus restricting black people from occupying a property for generations. More insidious in its approach, the federal government was also complicit in enforcing racial segregation. In the early 1930s, the U.S. economy was in free fall and in the throes of the Great Depression. Millions of Americans, white and black, were on the verge of losing their homes. In 1933, FDR signed into law the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act, which made it easier for Americans to borrow money and refinance homes because the loans were backed by the federal government. Nearly 40% of eligible Americans availed themselves of assistance under this program. It was hugely successful for those individuals who qualified, but it didn't apply equally to minorities. The Federal Housing Administration developed the Underwriting Manual, which spelled out the terms for federally backed mortgages.
They never quite had to use the term which would make it blatantly racial. They would use terms of protecting values and enhancing community.
The FHA Underwriting Manual, the way it's written and the way that it was used, emphasized stability. But the stability, it was believed, could not be achieved or maintained in a racially diverse neighborhood.
The manual explicitly stated that, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes.
So the FHA told the banks that they would not guarantee loans in integrated neighborhoods. They would not guarantee loans when African Americans moved into white neighborhoods. So basically it was emphasizing segregation.
The FHA was a tool of the housing industry. They were not social activists. They believed that they were protecting their economic base.
The FHA appraisers divided cities into neighborhoods and evaluated those neighborhoods based on several factors, one of which was the ethnicity of the residents. Based on this evidence, the FHA produced a map that categorized communities in terms of economic stability. They created an A to D rating system whereby each neighborhood was designated with a letter and color.
FHA takes maps of every large city in the United States and they color code neighborhoods, red being the most undesirable, green being the most desirable. Middle class and upper class white neighborhoods are always green. Black neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods are always red.
All the neighborhoods where African Americans lived in Indianapolis, according to the HOLC, were D neighborhoods. Even the quote-unquote better African Americans and the better Negro communities were all listed as D neighborhoods.
For decades, this map was a key reference used by mortgage lenders when considering loan applications. This practice would later become known as redlining. Redlining was the single largest factor that reduced the opportunity for African Americans to move beyond their prescribed neighborhoods.
Redlining was done, but we weren't actually told that it's being, redlined. You wouldn't qualify. That's the way they would put it.
Once a neighborhood was A, B, C, or D, a bank could then make a decision about whether they'll give a loan, not just for home purchases, but for home maintenance, renovations, what we would call a home equity loan today.
Home improvement loans, just like mortgages, were not given to neighborhoods that were redlined.
So if your house has a bad gutter and a bad roof, and you're in a D neighborhood, you're screwed.
The roof is compromised, it starts to leak, the structure becomes unsound, and eventually it will collapse because of lack of maintenance.
Even if you had a good job and good credit history, you're going to get a loan to build that neighborhood up. Because of that classification, the neighborhoods over time became blighted neighborhoods.
Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
The Homeowners Loan Corporation is one of those silent players in the creation of wealth inequality in the United States. Because if your house is your primary vehicle for wealth attainment in the United States, but you're not able to invest in your home, and you can't buy outside of a prescribed neighborhood, your wealth opportunities are limited artificially.
In the 1930s, as black neighborhoods continued to swell in Indianapolis and around the country, federal legislation was passed that attempted to alleviate congested cities by providing funds for states to build low-income public housing.
Public housing is subsidized housing, so the tenant pays a portion, the government pays the larger portion.
Public housing in Indianapolis started with Lockfield Garden. In 1934 began the construction, 1937 completed construction. When the construction was completed, it was the best housing available for African Americans in the city in a community-wide basis. But Lockfield Gardens had a restriction applied to it, which is if your income grew too much and you got over a certain threshold, you had to leave Lockfield Gardens within 6 months. What incentive do you have to grow your income? Because if you grow your income too much, you can be thrown into the private market, which is already admittedly inferior. The reasonable person, I assume, would just say, I'm going to restrict my employment opportunities or not report my income or have hidden income as best they can.
Despite this restriction, Lockfield Gardens was the only viable option for a number of African Americans to leave overcrowded houses. Further development of public housing could have been a solution for many black Hoosiers.
But Indianapolis was loath to accept public housing.
Indiana's been reluctant to take the money, partly because once they take the money, there are strings attached to what they can and cannot do.
The famous quote was, we will no longer suck at the teat of the federal government any further, because Lockfield Gardens was enough.
While other states accepted the federal dollars that alleviated housing congestion, Indiana largely chose to maintain the status quo. The practice of refusing federal aid resulted in even fewer options for blacks to relocate throughout Indianapolis. In 1944, the federal government enacted the GI Bill to recognize the sacrifice of soldiers by providing extraordinary benefits to veterans.
The idea was when these guys come home, they're going to need assistance in getting on their feet and getting reacclimated to civilian life. So we're going to give them affordable mortgages. We're going to give them assistance to go to college.
Under the GI Bill, veterans could get a free college education and a government-insured loan to purchase a home. However, of the first 67,000 loans issued, less than 100 were provided to non-whites.
The majority of black veterans could not get VA loans because they would not lend money to a black veteran to move into a white neighborhood. Probably one of the most classic examples of that is Levittown.
Located in Long Island, New York, Levittown was the first mass-produced suburb. William Levitt developed an innovative system that allowed his firm to build small homes stocked with all the modern appliances to the tune of 30 homes a day and sell them inexpensively. Levittown was very attractive to U.S. veterans returning home from war, and thousands of them took advantage.
There were a lot of veterans that moved into Levittown, but Levittown was pretty much all white for its first 20 years of existence.
William Levitt openly admitted that a mixed neighborhood would be bad for business. Therefore, the homes in Levittown came with racially restrictive covenants that stated that houses could not be used or occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race. So even if a black war hero came up with the cash to pay for the house, he wouldn't be allowed to do so. Levittown started a housing boom that drastically changed the American landscape. For the generation that survived the Great Depression and World War II, clean air and an affordable home on a plot of land away from the grind of the city was an attractive proposition. Suburbs quickly became a symbol of the American dream.
There's the attraction of moving to a new house with all the modern conveniences. They have new schools, new housing, new shopping, new everything. Of course, everybody wants a new home. But
white agents just did not show you properties that were in those areas.
If you called and you talked to them on the phone, they would gladly tell you all about the property. But when an African-American family showed up, quite often they were told the property's already been sold. And then you drive by days, weeks later, the for sale sign's still in the yard. They would not sell it to you.
We would see a sign, call that company, and they would just say they don't want to sell to a black family. So that ended that.
Most of the majority community agreed with the practice. There was a feeling that when blacks moved into a community, property values went down.
Blacks were not allowed. We just did not buy past our particular neighborhood, and we were held back of 30th Street.
South of 30th Street, you just did not. All the way across, east and west, on the east side, all the way over Emerson, all of those streets over there, south of 30th Street.
Even if you could afford to live outside of a defined ghetto, if you will, you couldn't find someone who would sell to you.
Born in Indianapolis in 1925, Reginald Bruce was an overachiever who took advantage of an excellent education at Crispus Attucks High School, one of the premier black schools in the country. At Attucks, Bruce was in the ROTC, and after graduation he was accepted into the U.S. Air Force, where he became a Tuskegee Airman. Following his stint as an aviator in World War II, Bruce returned to Indiana and enrolled in the medical training program at Indiana University. In 1954, he opened his own general practice in Indianapolis. He was, by most accounts, considered a successful man, the kind of person appreciated in his community. Despite his many accomplishments, Bruce had a difficult time finding housing outside of the designated areas allotted for African Americans in Indianapolis.
He runs headlong into racial discrimination, and he's running into it from the real estate agents, from the developers, from the neighbors. He is just one of any number in this city and across the country that faces the same problem. Your education, your skills, who you know, don't matter if you're Black.
You have inadequate housing, and you have a policy of segregation where the city doesn't allow you to expand beyond the neighborhoods. What happens then?
This is Indianapolis, crossroads of America, hub of the state. This too is Indianapolis, a part often overlooked, neglected, left to rot. These are our slums.
You have adult children living with their parents. These adult children are now having families of their own. Grandparents, parents, and grandchildren all living in the same house. Homes are being subdivided to where you're renting just one room. You share a bathroom and share a kitchen. Everything you can imagine in this neighborhood now is overburdened.
This is a slum, where housing is run down, often without water, plumbing, electricity, and central heat. But never a shortage of rats, disease, cracks, leaks, and people. This is a slum, where fire is frequent and often fatal, where disease is difficult to control, where most of a person's energy is spent just trying to survive.
We have a lot of cases that are living in just absolutely deplorable, unbelievable situations. Most of these houses don't have water in the house. They don't have sewer in the house. And of course, by not having that, they don't have any facilities either to have any sanitary conditions in the house.
What happens to families that live in situations and conditions like this, perhaps generation after generation?
They become hostile and aggressive towards society generally because of their own individual hardship. And I'm sure that this contributes also then to delinquency and aggressive feelings.
And yes, it even causes violent problems because they have too many people together too often, nerves fray, tempers flare, because there's no place else to go.
What do you think the effect of slum housing, substandard dwellings, has on a crime rate?
Well, I think it certainly contributes to the increase in crime.
It gives the white community it reinforces the idea that there's something wrong with them. By the time you get to the Highway Act in the 1950s, the highway drives right straight through those neighborhoods.
The Indiana State Highway Commission targeted minority neighborhoods because their property was much cheaper to buy.
You cannot ignore or get away from the racial component of how we got there. One small decision on top of another, one policy on top of another. The systemic racism is how we got here and why the properties were so cheap. My grandmother used to say that neighborhoods are like people. They had lives. They would be a new neighborhood and they would grow up and you'd look up and the neighbors were all growing old and getting gray hair, and at some point the neighborhoods would die. This was part of the thriving Indianapolis Black community down in this neighborhood. The interstate helped to kill this off.
In the 1960s and 70s, the minority neighborhoods were sliced in half by the new federal interstate project. Many homes were sacrificed. Over 17,000 people were displaced. Their children were cut off from their schools. Businesses failed, churches closed, and the community they had nourished for decades was completely disrupted.
In the 1960s, they did not take into consideration what the community there meant to the black people. And the reason they didn't have to take it into consideration is because the political strength of the African community was not such that they demanded concern and attention.
It's not as if the black community didn't try to protest. The Hubbard Center Civic League, for example, protested vigorously at numerous public hearings, and the residents from the 6th Ward united to propose an alternate route that would raise only 100 versus 500 living units. But their voices went unheard.
They sought intervention, they worked on their own behalf, they organized politically and socially for advance. They just lost.
Their political connections were not as strong as those in the white community. When the Morris Butler House was in the crosshairs of the Interstate project, the white community found shelter for it under the umbrella of the federal government through the National Historic Preservation Act. It was saved by those who understood how to wield the levers of power. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 made it illegal to deny any citizen, including blacks, the right to buy and own property. However, the act didn't provide a criminal penalty for those who violated the law. A century later, the Civil Rights Act of 1968 finally attached criminal penalties to discrimination practices. Also known as the Fair Housing Act, it expanded on previous legislation and made it a crime to discriminate on the financing, rental, or sale of housing based on race.
So if you think about that for a second, it took us until 1968 to pass the Fair Housing Act, to 1965 to pass the Equal Rights Act, 100 years or better after emancipation.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper.
Racism is deeply embedded into the American cultural system.
We have to go to the root. We have to go to the cause.
It started with the Founding Fathers. The citizens of color were 3/5 of a person. It gave the slaveholders in this country tremendous political power. They could count their slaves for purposes of electing people to public office, but did not have to recognize any of their rights as citizens, according to both the Constitution and Supreme Court decision called the Dred Scott decision, where the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court says that a black person had no rights which white people had to respect. A black person had no rights which white people had to respect.
The injustice that has been inflicted upon Negroes in this country by Uncle Sam is criminal. When a criminal starts misusing me, I am going to use whatever is necessary to get that criminal off my back. If he's not ready to clean his house up, he shouldn't have a house. It should catch on fire and burn down.
Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land